Before we actually discuss the questions, I think there are one or two definitions that may be amusing and rather surprising to the non-technical person relating to the meaning of the word temperament. The word comes from the Latin temperamentum, which means well-balanced. Now that's just about as far from the popular meaning as we can possibly get. A temper fit, then, would be an outburst of equilibrium. And I'm afraid that isn't the way in which it generally works. A temperamental person is technically an individual whose temperament is well balanced. Now I presume a certain number of temperamental people will agree with that, but their friends won't. The word actually implies a very fine moderation, a good degree of equilibrium, whereas in our general experience it implies problem. We also might be interested in attempting to understand the term temperament as we find it philosophically considered. A temperament represents the degree of balance attained by the elements of the mental and emotional nature. A temperament, therefore, is a continuing over factor. Just as climate represents the general condition of the temperature of an area or a nation, so temperament is the climate of the person. Weather, on the other hand, represents a passing phase. And we have the same problem in dispositional outbreaks, where we seem to find that disposition is subject to many modifications, but the temperament, generally speaking, is consistent with itself until some major changes are accomplished. The individual can control a disposition, and he can change or modify a temperament. Very seldom, however, does a major temperamental change come about without a major effort of some kind. The exception lies in a crisis or critical situation. Some individuals are caused to change suddenly under a tremendous pressure. But otherwise, temperament must be educated. It must be worked with. And changes in it, basic changes, will be slow. And in many cases, even those trying very hard do not succeed in making a major change in a basic temperament. The ancients assumed that temperaments arose from certain chemical situations in the body. They held that the temperaments were modified or largely influenced by the nativity of the individual at birth, and that is, in his horoscope. Others felt that temperament was an essential quality of the soul, that it came into birth with the person, and that he gradually unfolded it according to opportunities. It is certain that the person in his life here has his continuous conflict with the personality temperament pattern, and his reaction to a situation is very largely a matter of temperament. Thus, if he is by nature a well-balanced individual, he will react in that way. If by nature he has excessive emotions, or is inclined to some peculiar habits of thinking and emotion, these will influence his life continuously. One of the most valuable assets that any of us can have is a good basic temperament. And this basic temperament must involve a certain maturity of control over the elements of our own dispositions, and certain foundations in knowledge and understanding by means of which we are able to meet the various problems of life. Thus, the enrichment of temperament usually results from a well-rounded effort to improve, and this effort must be sustained over a considerable period of time. Now we'll take some of these questions and see what we can do with them. I might like to point out that under the conditions, it would probably be wisest not to use repetitive questions or questions exceedingly similar, unless we can detect a basic difference in the point of view or in the need of the individual. Also, questions that are not suitable, are facetious or unreasonable, cannot be considered, or such questions as the answering of which might in any way be considered an infringement upon strictly classified levels of activity, such as diagnosis of disease and things of that nature. Those things we cannot attempt. Also, questions which would require an intimate knowledge of the individual would hardly be suitable. But anyway, we will go along and see what we can find out about these questions, and we are rather hoping that this series of evenings will smoke out some interesting problems. In other words, during the years, people have saved up doubts on various matters, or would like some special enlightenment or special thinking about some problem. And this is the opportunity for you to ask such questions within the fields of our provinces in these lectures. We have limited them because I'm hoping that they will make some kind of a general pattern and that we will have an evening which goes in some direction, whereas in so many instances, general open questions simply go nowhere in particular. So we'll start with a few of them and see what we can find out that might be interesting. I've picked them by color or something of that nature to start with. Here's a lovely shade of pale green. Why do personality defects and lower drives and urges seem to be increased when one starts on the path of self-development? That's a good question. Actually, we can say the same thing about most any project that we endeavor. The more definitely we set ourselves to a goal, the more effort we must use. To drift is a comparatively simple problem, although it may lead to very complex consequences. But to take hold of a life and direct it to a purpose requires continuity and a reasonable degree of energy, more thoughtfulness than the average person likes to expend on such projects, and in general will cause obstacles to appear more real and more frequent. There's an old saying, it's a bit of a cliche, but it's not bad at that very seldom does anyone throw a stone in the path of someone who is going nowhere. The moment we head in any direction, the moment we put a directive over our own conduct, we are likely to get in difficulty with other people, for example, because these other people may have for some time felt that they had a private right to direct our conduct. Very often the individual drifts along under strong influence from other persons. Then deciding to start out on his own, he offends these various persons who have gradually taken a proprietary attitude toward him. They feel that they own him. They feel that anything they say he should do. The moment he fails to comply, then there's quite a shock for all concerned. Also, a person who has been led for a long time frequently reduces his own power of self-leadership and finds it increasingly difficult to administer his own affairs. There is a certain consolation in living under a pattern in which there is always someone else to blame for our troubles. If we do not exercise our own prerogatives, and we let other persons bend us to their ends and objectives, we always have the consolation of being able to blame them if anything goes wrong. The moment we become really responsible for our own decisions and live up to them, we must face more of the weakness inside of ourselves. We become more aware of our own inabilities. We become conscious, perhaps, that we have run with the herd rather too long, and that to stand on our own feet is not only a new experience, but a rather trying one. It's like learning to walk after we have probably gone around for a while in a perambulator. We have to learn to accept responsibility. We have to learn to accept the consequences of our own conduct. We must learn to make decisions and go through a whole series of new types of instruction. And from what information we are able to gather on the subject, I would say that the person who stands on his own feet, does his own thinking, and makes his own decisions, and does all these things with reasonable intelligence, and without an unreasonable effort to impose himself upon other people, an individual, therefore, who has learned the importance of being a person, such an individual is very much in the minority group. I imagine that under analysis we would realize that probably not one person in 100 is standing on his own feet. And probably not one person in 10 makes the half dozen major decisions in his own life. This means that apparently the way gets harder. We also know that in religious matters, the effort to live according to a fairly high spiritual code brings us into a rather stressful relationship with a world nominally religious, but which does not actually attempt to apply its principles. Thus, if we are willing to compromise and drift, we have not the same likelihood of having a head-on collision with someone else. But the moment we try to live a little better than other people, we begin to find that we are strange in this world, that by degrees many associations, pleasant or unpleasant, begin to drop away, simply because other people will not follow us. And if we fail to compromise in their benefit, they will not make much effort to compromise in ours. Thus, the higher our code, the stricter our way of life, the more difficult it appears to become. Now, the solution to this lies in our basic approach. The individual who takes on a better way of life, purely from intellectual, moral, or ethical grounds, has very little inner support to help him. A better way of life must arise from better interior convictions. If the conviction factor is missing, if this better way of life is not motivated by adequate mental, emotional strength, then our conduct very often actually comes in conflict with our own desires. And we find the person who has resolved desperately to be a vegetarian standing out in front of one of these little stands where they cook food in the window and actually drooling while he sees a steak frying. He is suffering for a principle, but his suffering is rather non-eventuating and not very useful. He is not behind himself. He is not standing with his own convictions. He has taken on something because he thought he should, but his heart and soul are not in it. Every time we really attempt to grow, we must have heart and soul support from within ourselves. And it is generally not wise for a person to live beyond the point where he is able to sustain himself by his own inward resources. If he tries to go beyond his resources, he has nothing to sustain him in time of trouble. Therefore, all growth actually must begin within the person, and must gradually cause the disposition to become consistent with this inner growth. The personality should change to meet the temperament. We should not expect the personality to stand alone on some premise and then have to struggle not only with the world but with the person himself, that part of his own inner life which is simply not consistent with the improvement which he is trying to achieve. That's why it has always seemed to me a mistake to place upon persons obligations, as many organizations do, religious and ethical. They say to the individual, this thou shalt not do, this thou shalt do. And if you do not obey these rules, you cannot be one of us. Such obligations have very often led to most unfortunate results. The individual, perhaps socially desirous, or even sincerely, spiritually anxious to become associated with a certain group, tries desperately to live the regulations that are imposed upon him. But his nature is not adjusted to them, his temperament is not suited to them, and instead of gaining insight and growth, he comes only to rapid confusion. This type of thing, I remember in one case, a certain organization, which quite justifiably and quite commendably was much opposed to wearing of furs. Now, this is a very commendable idea, and certainly there is no conflict with it. But a person applying for membership in the organization happened to live a long way away, up in the northern end of the Hudson's Bay Company, where it gets around 40, 50 below zero every winter. And this member had quite a time trying to keep warm and at the same time not break the rules of the new organization he joined up with. This type of thinking is rather too severe for the average person to be able to live with it comfortably. It is much better to gradually grow rather serenely with inner insight, and realize that under that type of discipline, you really seldom, if ever, have to make a decision. The decisions make themselves. What you no longer want, you find very little difficulty in giving up. What you now desire and decide that you do want, you then seek full-heartedly. But decisions which are contrary to instinct or contrary to the present attainment of the individual will nearly always cause trouble. Now this question also perhaps implies the situation of moral pressures, emotional pressures. The individual may, under our way of thinking, feel that spiritual growth means that he must depart from most of the normal relationships of human life, that he must spiritualize these relationships far more rapidly than he's capable of achieving. If he tries this, he will end not with a better spiritual life, but a rather wrecked one. Here again, the person must grow from the inside, and when he reaches a certain degree of enlightenment, there will be no conflict. He will not have these pressures suddenly rising within himself, which he has to fight, as Jacob wrestled with the angel. Where we have to fight all the time, there's something basically wrong. Actually, growth is not a warfare. Buddha points that out. Socrates pointed that out. Actually, the unfolding person lives what he believes. He nearly always lives this totally. And where belief and conduct differ, then the belief is not real. The belief has been accepted from traditional grounds or by recommendation of other persons, or because the person has read something which indicated this might be desirable. Now, of course, we have general levels of human conduct, and an individual falling below these levels may criticize himself as not being able to live a proper balanced or duly moral life. Where he is below a certain level, then certainly every effort should be made to bring his own temperament up to that level. But in the effort to strain beyond ability, we find the cause of a great deal of human misery. We do not have an elaborate or adequate literature at the present time on religious psychology, but my experience over 40 years of work with it is that many persons of devout and sincere belief and desire actually make themselves desperately ill in the effort to be good. Where the effort is that serious, we can't say to the person, don't try to be good. We can say to that person, try to enrich your inner life so that this struggle ceases. And if you cannot enrich your life to that degree, then live a moderate, temperate life, and do not attempt extraordinary virtues for which you are not immediately prepared. I know many cases of individuals trying to live the spiritual codes of organizations who have ended their careers in mental institutions. There is only so much the person can do. This temperament problem is too basic. And to grow in terms of temperament means to grow slowly. And to turn suddenly from one kind of life to another with merely enthusiasm to sustain you is very likely to end in serious disaster. So we say on that ground, moderation comes before an extreme way of life. A person who has never disciplined themselves should not suddenly over-discipline themselves. The first ground is moderation. To remove excess from disposition is, of course, of the greatest importance. It is better to moderate reasonably and then move slowly from moderation on to something else. But we can never jump over the gap where moderation should be. From the excess on the one hand to a total abstinence on the other is too large a jump. Therefore, we move all things into moderation. Now, nature is a creature of moderate ways. Nature's ways are finally the best ways. And where our human-made systems of thinking differ from nature, then we have to proceed with extreme caution. It is true that we have the right to try to unfold higher forms of natural law than those with which we are commonly associated. But nature's way is to move gradually, and from excess to gradually modify excess until we achieve temperance. And for most persons, temperance is the most important virtue that we can develop. Temperance means that by degrees we remove from our conduct those extreme actions which are the greatest cause of our sorrow and tragedy. And if we can live temperately, we then gain something else. We gain a certain internal relaxation. We do not have the fight with ourselves that we would have if we are too strenuous. Temperance makes a new foundation from which we can go to greater moderation if we so desire, so that we go by steps rather than by trying to make one magnificent leap to perfection. I've never found anyone yet who can walk out of the ordinary walks of life and in 6 months overcome and subdue all imperfections of character. It is much too much to be hoped. It would be better to say, let us overcome one of the most objectionable aspects of our nature. This will probably be a life work. And if we get that under control, we can move to something else. But perfection lies in aeons of time and in many lives, and not in an immediate dash for nirvana. So if you don't go too far and too fast, we get along better. I don't know that I haven't completely exhausted this question. Let me just take another look at it. Why do personality defects and lower drives and urges seem to be increased? I think they're increased because the inconsistency begins to develop pressure. In other words, if you hold on to yourself too hard, you begin to build up frustration. And even though your goal may be good, if you have to fight with yourself too hard to reach it, the difference between the inner pressure to go one way and your mental reserve to go the other way, this struggle will result in a psychological tension. It may end in a distinct trauma. Another thing is, as we become more watchful and begin to block escape mechanisms, we either have to do something about these qualities that are troublesome, or else they will ultimately break through as a river breaks through a dam and escapes. Thus, if the tensions begin to rise, then it means that we haven't sufficient foundation to prevent these tensions from building. Another thing that very often happens is that persons attempting to develop themselves, to use the common parlance of the day, go off the deep end. They begin to believe that almost anything that is normal or natural is wrong. They begin to believe that a pleasant afternoon with their friends is a loss and a waste of time. They must be at the busy task of salvation continuously once they are bitten by that particular bug. And this busy task of salvation is exhausting because the person does not know what salvation is, and he does not know how to be busy in a useful and happy manner. So the effort to become good too rapidly simply upsets the entire psychic chemistry. It's far better for the person to sit down rather quietly and make a list of the assets and liabilities of his own disposition. When he does this, he must not cater to some one particular thing. For instance, an individual with a bad disposition whom I knew made a whole list of his weaknesses and then decided that the thing he was going to do was to develop patience. But he had a wonderful definition for patience. It was that he was going to resign himself to suffering from the mistakes of everyone else. Now that's a wonderful way of giving yourself a perfect whitewash. Because his patience now was to be a long-suffering endurance of the wrongs of others. He never did get around to correcting anything worthwhile in himself. This type of thinking is natural evasion. We are all inclined to follow it. And in estimating our problems, we want to be careful that we do not pick the one which seems to cater to our own ego the most. If we are critical of other people, that's a good one to work on. And not that we should simply become blind to their mistakes. That's the negative end. We're still subtly working on the ground that they are the cause of trouble. But in criticism, begin to estimate why we are hypocritical and maybe hypocritical. Why is it that we are unable to adjust ourselves to faults in others when we have the same or equal faults ourselves? So we can gradually get a more sensible attitude in this process of building a balanced character. But a person who wants to live a deeper life must not forget that he can drown in it, that it can be too deep, that he requires recreation, It requires natural, happy interests. It requires variety of experience. He needs social contact because, after all, we learn to live by contacting other things that do live. Now, I know persons who have become serious. They think, well, now, we can't waste any more time. We're behind time on our development now, and therefore let's speed it up. And they try to go home and study 7 nights a week. And every time a friend or member of the family appears, it's a ghastly interruption. This type of thing will soon get everybody into a bad way, and will cause our friends and relatives to think our religion is pretty foolish. It is to keep a nice balance. The deeply thoughtful person must always guard against the deep end situation, because, after all, our mentalities and our psychic balance cannot stand continuous strain in any direction. We must have variety. It's possible that a deeply religious person resents having to work because it interferes with the time they'd like to be studying. Actually, the work is more important to them than the study, because it is through the daily work that man's temperament is forced into certain patterns of discipline, and also that the individual is not free all the time to do what he pleases. He must have certain free time, but he must also have diversity. And if after a day in business he then decides to do moderate study, he has variety. Whereas if the business was removed and he studied all the time, he'd soon be spiritually sick. So I don't think that these problems increase as the result of spiritual development. I think we come face to face with facts, and when suddenly confronted with unfamiliar facts, they seem to rise like ghosts from nowhere. They were always there, but we did not notice them. They were always present, but we pushed them aside and went on to other things. Our problems do not get bigger, but we become more aware of them. Also, under any form of discipline, we become rebellious. And as this question implies, the rebellion of our selfishness, of perhaps our sensuality, of our appetites, all these rebellions are against discipline, like the small child who will try every possible way to escape proper discipline, yet will be very miserable later if this discipline is not available. Most persons have spoiled themselves as they spoil children. Therefore, when they try not to spoil themselves, they find they have an incorrigible inside of themselves. To straighten that type of thing out, let us not think in terms of the problems becoming bigger, but merely that we've opened our eyes a little more widely to them. Now, there's one other point, namely that in Oriental philosophy, there is the belief that the person who sincerely starts to walk the path of discipleship also expects to pay off karma more rapidly than if he was drifting along through the years. If he wants to cut down the time element in connection with the unfoldment of his own nature, he must not only make positive growth, but he must pay debts more rapidly. Many feel that this is one of the explanations for what appears to be the piling up of problems. There is a phase of this. The more rapidly we travel, the more rapidly the scenes change, and the more rapid our adjustments must be. We must pay our bills more rapidly. We must do everything in a more efficient temper and tempo than before. The decisions come more rapidly because we are moving faster. The person who is drifting may make 5 decisions in a lifetime. The individual who is really trying may have to make 5 decisions in a year. This means he has to make more decisions. But this does not mean that it is more difficult. It simply means that he must try to avoid the natural tendency to procrastinate, to evade decisions, and finally let them accumulate until they become mountainous. This, I think, covers most of the points involved in the question. Hope it does anyway. We'll get back now to somebody else. We can't have just one person here. Well, here's another one. This we can do something with. I always read them first because I didn't once. Well, what do you suggest to help us to break our old pattern of thinking, which we may find ourselves slipping into, specifically our old pattern of reactions to our contacts? Well, this is more or less a development of the previous question. Now we're getting a little pattern. I don't know how long it'll last, but it's moving. Patterns of thinking arise from patterns of experience and living. Our attitudes toward life are nearly always the result of what we have done, where we have been, and the persons we have met. Mostly our patterns are too small because our contacts and experiences have been too limited. The individual is not usually very much interested in other people. Yet it is from others that our most valuable lessons may be learned. Thus, being more or less self-centered, we go through life without meeting a neighbor. We live in a community. We take practically no part in community life. We take advantage of the privileges that come to us easily and quickly, but we seldom stretch toward the unknown. If we do, it is likely to be on some abstract subject. We may spend a considerable amount of time researching on unidentified flying objects, but we do not know anything about the people across the street. We do not recognize or know enough about life relationships. And although we live in large communities, we remain rather small people. We may live in a large world without that world apparently showing very much on us. I remember as a boy growing up, I lived in a small town outside of one of the larger cities of Canada. And of course, at that time, Canada was somewhat behind the United States in its general policies, being much more bound to England than to the Western Hemisphere. And there was an elderly lady in this town who somewhere along the line suddenly sort of stopped adjusting. And she stopped adjusting, I guess, around the 60s or 70s. Because in the early 20th century, 1904, 5, and 6, this lady wandered around the street in hoop skirts. Now, hoop skirts were even then rather passé, I should say by about 40 years. She had never considered riding in a train. That would just be too much for her. She believed, I guess, like the old minister, that anything that went over 5 miles an hour broke the laws of God and man. She had no contact with the changing conditions of the world in which she lived. I remember when the telephones came in this particular community, which was a smaller community. Of course, she wouldn't have one. Then they developed horse cars and later street cars. She wouldn't ride in them. She was living in her own private universe. Now, most people today are not quite that bad. But there is a tendency for many persons simply to live in private worlds. I hear them say it frequently. I say, what kind of a world do you live in? Oh, I live in the world of my children. I don't need anything else. I have 3 or 4 growing children. They're just my world. Well, that world can cramp us somewhere along the line, particularly when those children grow up and would like to have their own lives. Then suddenly the curtains go up in all directions and we find ourselves in a larger universe and no way to adjust to it. I think the question in some degree here means that old patterns of thinking represent limitations arising from inadequate relationships with life. We get into ruts. Our old patterns of thinking, perhaps, are the job, the street we live on, the monthly bills, the continuous remembrance of the way we have lived, perhaps prior to the rather stressful generation that now dominates the scene. But the old patterns of thinking are not adequate because they must be enlarged. And if we can enlarge them, we will have much more release for our various attitudes. Now, how do we enlarge them? Enlarge interests. Find new activities, even though at the time it may seem difficult to do so. Do not be afraid that a new activity is going to wear you out. What is probably wearing you out is the lack of it. You take a person who works 8 to 10 hours a day, and they have some side responsibilities in addition. This individual would hardly like to take on a major activity. They fear that it would fatigue them more. Such is not the case. Man does not rest by doing nothing. Nature has decreed that he rests by a variety of activities. Certainly he must sleep. But recreation and letting down and resting in the sense of getting away from tension is seldom to be achieved by a negative relationship with life. The person who does nothing will soon be doing something wrong. He will begin to worry. He will begin to have too much time for negation, unless his time is actively engaged in purposeful endeavor. Therefore, if the person's pattern of thinking is not adequate, study, interest in larger fields of thought, training to become a world citizen, training to understand the various phases of life which make up human relationships and human enterprises. This type of thing will get us out of our old habits rather quickly. If we are in ruts, new interests will bring us in contact with new people. New people, in turn, will bring interest with them if we will open ourselves to this problem. Very close to this is another type of question in which a person says, I have trouble finding friends. I'd like to have people, that I can get out with and enjoy life without being forced to either go into a state of inebriation or boredom or something in the course of the evening. The individual will say, I have no friends and I just can't tolerate bridge. This, again, means old patterns, problems. To have interesting friends, and they exist potentially for everyone, the individual himself must be doing interesting things. The person who seeks interesting friends because he's bored with himself will never find them. But the person who becomes interesting to other people. Thus, as our interests enlarge, we meet persons who have interests rather than people who simply are going to lean on us and ask us to keep them out of the doldrums. Several negative persons getting together can create a low-pressure area that's unbelievable. The matter always is to get with people who are interesting. You will not find them among people who have nothing to do. You will not find them sitting around bored as you may be. You will find that their lives have taught them that to be interesting, they must have interests. So if there's any question about this, look into the world of the things we do not know and pick things we would like to know and go to work on them. And it is often interesting and valuable to develop skills, to develop craft or hobby abilities, to develop art or music interests, not merely as listeners, but as actual participators. And as soon as we do so, we will begin to meet people who have achieved in these fields. And we will find that our level of friendships rise, because these people are no more interested in a dull evening than we are. The people who are interested in a dull evening are doing the same thing we might be doing. They are trying to run away from themselves. So old patterns of thinking have to be broken by new patterns of thinking, imposed upon them, not forcefully, not by saying this old pattern is wrong and I'm going to run away from it, I'm going to walk out of it, but by developing new patterns with the old pattern, right with it. Don't get rid of the old one, just begin to develop new ones. And after a little while, the old one disappears. Its resources are absorbed into the larger patterns which we are developing. It is very seldom any use to attack things with a desperate determination to destroy them. Old ways are not adequate. We don't destroy them. We simply develop new ways, and the limitations of the old ways disappear of their own accord. Problems do not need to be kicked around. They need to be outgrown. And we outgrow them as soon as we are bigger than the problem. As soon as the individual is bigger than a problem, he has no problem. While the problem is bigger than he is up to his neck in it all the time. And broader thinking is the answer to many questions. Now, on the philosophical and religious levels, broader thinking is also a tricky thing, because many people believe that their old ways of thinking are of such sanctity or such importance that it is little short of treason or heresy to break them. The person who wants to be loyal to his own older thinking must also sometimes rebel against large groups of persons who are held in that same pattern. But we either have to accept the boredom, accept the inadequacy, or else we have to turn against it and do better. And for the religious person, or for the philosophical person to grow, is sometimes far more difficult than for the materialist to grow. Because the materialist can really grow in so many directions with so few obstacles. But a person heavily indoctrinated with ideas has to fight all his own ideas as well as the world. So don't fight them. Just simply go out and investigate, realizing that all of our patterns, all of our thoughts should be based upon facts and not upon prejudice or tradition or old patterns. Now, many old patterns are good, but the good part of the old pattern will never go. A good that cannot grow is not a real good. The fine values in things will never cease because we grow. But we will learn to understand and use these fine values more intelligently and more constructively. An old pattern means a way of life that you have outgrown. The moment you recognize that it's not adequate, you are confronted with the problem of becoming adequate. And if you do not meet this challenge, you will slowly become more and more bored and more sick. So the moment you realize that there's something bigger, it means you've already discovered the need for it. And from that time, you cannot rest until you have achieved it. Nature doesn't expect you or want you to rest. Nature is constant motion. Emerson said, consistency is the bugbear of little minds. We sometimes have to be inconsistent. But if our purposes are big enough, we will grow. Now someone will say, well, I might make a bad mistake. Yes, that's quite possible. In growing, we frequently make mistakes. But if we are gracious and honest and honorable and idealistic in our growing, we expect to make mistakes. We expect to make mistakes in many levels of decision. The average individual may make a mistake when he buys a house. He may not get the house he thought he was buying, or he may not find the neighborhood what he thought it was. An individual buying an automobile can easily make a mistake, so he writes it off. He writes it off to experience and tries to be wiser next time. The same thing with personal problem mistakes. If we make a mistake and are big enough to recognize it and meet it gallantly because we did make it, and no one's to blame but ourselves, most of the sting will disappear from the mistake. And we will realize that we have learned something, perhaps a precious and vital lesson, even by being mistaken. So don't worry too much about it. Here is apparently a definite little matter. My lady boss says, I have an anxiety complex. Fortunately, she's most considerate, but it would help me to find a way to control my emotional temperament, at least in the office. I'm always on the verge of tears. Well, that's a marvelous employee. I think the lady boss must be a really nice person. Personal problems cause this disturbance. My working conditions are very good and I need the job. How can I best control my emotions? Well, now here's something in which we come skating very close to the point where an individual needs personal help. But we'll do what we can based upon the general theme that is suggested here, and a little of it's between the lines. The difficulty, the anxiety complex, according to this little note, arises from personal problems. And these personal problems keep the individual in a continuous state of anxiety. The working conditions are good, but due to inability to control the emotional temperament, they are frequently on the verge of tears, apparently, even in the office and away from some other location where perhaps the problem is centered. An anxiety mechanism, of course, is a type of fear problem, and probably in a case like this also involves worry. I would say that emotional control for this person, or for any person who is unable to separate their employment and their employment responsibilities from their personal life, this emotional control means the need, or the demand for it, means constructive, creative, positive mental activities. You cannot simply turn the safety valve off and let the emotional pressure build up inside. Usually a person in this condition will not react well to platitudes. They know they should control the emotions, but they cannot. There are several possibilities. Perhaps this individual has an unfinished problem in the personal situation, which should be finished in some way. Perhaps these anxieties depend to a measure upon the failure of the individual to settle, solve, and end situations that are not right. Perhaps they are trying to drift them along. Perhaps they're hoping for the best. Perhaps they do not want to hurt someone. Perhaps they have created a network of circumstances which they cannot escape from without a violent decision which is more than they can bear to make. Perhaps there is a problem which seemingly has no reasonable termination, having escaped to the degree from control in which apparently only the grace of God can do anything about it. There are all kinds of possible causes, and as we want to keep the questions as general as possible, we can only hope that we will hit the one in this case. But other persons with similar situations may find some comfort or consolation from certain recommendations which we can make. Anxiety that causes a person to be tearful and fearful at a great part of the time usually or frequently involves an overripe decision that needs making and needs it desperately. Though very often also people in this situation are either trying to live other people's lives or have permitted other people to dominate their lives. I know, for example, how difficult it would be for a sensitive daughter to finally decide that she is going to walk out on her widowed mother. There is a kind of problem that is apparently one in which every factor of human life is involved. Loyalties, will be played upon. And very often where you get a condition of this kind, the person has been conditioned. Their sympathies have been played upon. Their integrity has been played upon, often viciously, by other people. Also, fear of the future, fear of sickness, fear of age, fear of lack of funds. All of these things can create these anxieties. Also, the inability of the individual to help someone in great grief or need. A case where the children are the cause of the gravest possible anxiety. All of these different problems can come in, from fear of self, to fear of family, to fear of life, to fear of world. All of these types of things can come in. Anxiety, however, as we know, is not a constructive emotion. It will ultimately produce the very disasters which perhaps the person most fears. The fearful and anxious woman who is the only support of her two small children, by allowing her anxiety to rise continuously, her fear that something might happen to her and leave these children desolate and destitute, this very anxiety is likely to break her down and destroy her power to help them. Wherever anxiety becomes too stressful, it destroys any value that we may be to other people. This we have to face, realizing that if we are depended upon, if we are needed, if we are necessary, then it is especially needed that we shall keep ourselves in as constructive and optimistic and cheerful a disposition as possible. Otherwise, sickness and loss will be the result, and we will be less capable of taking care of those who need help. It is very important for people to help others, but it is very, very important for us to use discrimination in helpfulness. Contributing to the delinquency and spoiling of others is no virtue, no value, and no help to anyone. To put up with or tolerate an impossible situation forever is not virtue, not religion, not good sense. We are responsible to other people to a degree when we demand that these people be self-responsible also. To take care of people, to nurse them because they expect us to, is very often a thankless task in which there is grave doubt whether we are right or not. Very often, a lifetime of patience is merely a lifetime of weakness. Many persons endure because it is more comfortable to endure than it is to face head into a situation and cure it. They are afraid of the big scene, so they go on for 25 years with a series of little scenes, which gradually wear everyone out, including the person they're afraid of. Meet these problems wherever possible. If the situation is curable, gather all your courage and use the cure you know. If you do not know what to do, but are still convinced that something can be done, then seek advice and counsel in the matter. There are counselors available for nearly all these problems. But remember that it is not a religious virtue to be imposed upon. Surely it is better to be imposed upon than to impose upon anyone else. But best of all is not to be imposed upon and not to impose upon anyone else. So that this idea that some folks have, that you are required in order to gain the crown of martyrdom, to endure your miseries patiently or impatiently for half a lifetime. This is not good philosophy. and it's not good religion. It is the type of thing that ultimately leads to disillusionment and despair and discouragement, sickness and death. So if you are under an anxiety, if the anxiety is real, seek counsel and help and solve it. If the anxiety is purely psychological, then counseling is indicated to clear up the situation. If, however, you have plenty of physical reason to be anxious, then go to work on those reasons and reduce them. There is nearly always some way of reducing them. And if you cannot do it yourself, get expert help and advice so that you can do it. And do not dramatize your own place in a situation. I know one case, for example, of a family of several children and one elderly parent. There is an old saying in the Talmud that it is more difficult for 10 sons to support one mother than it is for 10 mothers to support one son. The difference is very difficult. This problem, then, balances down to a very simple situation. This family had that kind of a problem, where a number of children were unable to take care of the one mother, although the one mother had taken care of all of them earlier. So one person carried the whole load, not only the load of the mother, but of several of the other children who were selfish and rather delinquent people. In the due course of time, heaven called this faithful soul to itself, leaving a terrible vacuum. On the deathbed, the person who had been the strength of the family really died very sadly and very unhappily because they felt they were leaving only destitution behind them. No one would ever be able to carry on. 3 months later, the mystery had solved itself. As soon as these people had to do something, they did. But they would never do it while this one faithful person would carry all the load. So it isn't fair to anyone concerned to carry these loads. It is far fairer to realize that selfish people must stand on their own feet. The same is true of unreasonable marriage partners. If these people are miserably unreasonable, then the facts must be faced. To go on anxiously and miserably under these fears and anxieties, permitting affection to become enslaved, permitting the life to be damaged in all of its individuality, is not intended in nature. It is far better to realize that after you make a clear break or a clear solution to something, everybody is better off and everyone knows where they stand. And this increasing knowledge is very valuable to all concerned. I know cases where anxiety is extended for years. It never gained anything for anyone. If it is a blind anxiety, then it's a psychological problem in the individual. Where anxiety is a psychological problem within the person himself, he must analyze his own nature, if he can, to find out how and why this pattern has taken over. If he's unable to do this, then he must seek help. If he is able to do it, then he must realize that anxiety, like worry, takes time. He must therefore have time in which to do these things. And it is far better to fill his time with other activities so that he simply does not have that time. Using every available amount of consciousness for the improvement of himself or the service of others, he will find that he doesn't have quite so much time for anxiety. There's a blindness about anxiety that is very deadly. And wherever it exists, it should be cleared up as much as possible. In the meantime, do not depend on sedations for control. Try to develop outside interests and autocorrective compensations. If you're a very emotional person by nature, then develop powerful emotional interests. And in art or music or crafts or social service or in one way or another, try to find ways of using your emotions more constructively. How can more patience be developed? I don't think this is by a doctor. It isn't spelled that way. Patience comes under several headings. I have mentioned already this evening one kind of patience. This idea of having patience to get along with other people's mistakes. That is not the kind we should develop, really. We have to have a certain amount of it, of course, to get along. But we should not be so conscious of their mistakes as to make this a centralizing motive. If we are by nature impatient, it generally means that we are either ambitious and are being a little frustrated in our ambition, or that for us changes that we desire, conditions that we want, are not coming around as rapidly as we hope they will. Many young people today are terribly impatient, particularly in matters of career. The adolescent is impatient in the development of his emotional life. Patience, however, is a word that has gotten into very bad usage. It has become a very negative and rather sour word. But beneath it there are values that we have to face. Patience, in our discussion of Zen, if you'll remember, we pointed out the tremendous importance of now. Patience has something to do more with this focusing of consciousness upon now. Impatience will have the problem of the focus of consciousness upon tomorrow, in which we wish to move as rapidly as we can. If we hasten, we are liable not to watch our step, however, and fall. Patience really means focusing the attention upon things as they are and performing them so thoroughly that they will inevitably lead to reasonable consequences according to our desires. Some persons will never be able to make the world move rapidly enough to meet their need. They are naturally impatient. They want things quickly. They also become impatient with the slowness of other minds. And there is nothing that can be a greater trial to patience than to be associated with individuals who are slow of thinking, or whose own tempos of life are very slow or dull or unchanging. I would say, practically speaking, that to develop what we like to think of as patience is nothing more or less than seeing the facts as they are. If we see the facts, we can be neither patient nor impatient. Each thing has its own rhythms, its own values, innate in itself. We may be impatient over the growth of a child, but nothing can change the real rhythms of that growth. And if we try to hasten the growth of the child emotionally or mentally, inviting it to precocity, we will usually regret it later. There is nothing that can change a 6-year-old child into a 7-year-old child except 1 year of time. And the same is true of many achievements that we want. Certain things must happen. They must happen in the right way. Our problem is not to hasten them, really, but to see that they do happen in the right way. And if things happen in the right way, the results of those things will also duly occur. Instead of being impatient and jumping forward, the problem is to build the cause now of that which is desired, or that condition which is hoped for. If it is a matter of character adjustment with other people, and it seems as though we must be patient with situations that only time can change, and that to change them forcibly would be against our ethics and against our moral sense of value, then patience means acceptance. And acceptance means understanding and vision, by which we take a situation and learn from it, rather than become beggared by it. That which cannot be changed must be carried with dignity. And the moment we accept the fact that it cannot be changed, our impatience will cease. If it can be changed, then it should be changed. But very often, in thoughtful persons, patience is required for situations which only time and circumstances beyond our control can directly alter. Under those conditions, we must continue to carry this situation, but we must carry it with dignity. We must carry it as part of a pattern. If, for instance, we have a certain responsibility which we must carry, then it cannot and must not become an obsession. Very common problem in this situation today is alimony, where one person is paying alimony and looks forward perhaps to paying it for the rest of their lives. They can become very troubled and very unhappy about the whole thing and feel that it is a terrific injustice. But if it is something that cannot be changed, then it must be carried by a minimum of mental effort. There is no use wasting time in regrets. There's no use hoping or fearing anything. The thing to do is build around the situation as it is, as full and rich a life as possible, refusing to devote any time or energy beyond that which is absolutely necessary to the contemplation of the difficulty. Do not build on it. Do not regret it. Do not be sorry for yourself. Simply accept it as one phase of life. Carry it and continue to live. If you allow yourself to be sorry for yourself or think about this injustice too much, you will soon destroy not only a fragment of your life, but the whole life. Impatience also can cause a detail to become so big that it absorbs our entire consciousness. This, of course, is also a very sad thing because it only impoverishes us. It is therefore extremely important, rather than to take the attitude of enduring, take the attitude of this thing is as it is. Now let us go on and live otherwise, and do the best we can with it. It's like the individual, the old sea captain I once knew, who said there's no use getting mad at a wooden leg. If you've got it, that's it. There's no use wishing you didn't have it. There's no use being mad because you can't get around as rapidly or as effectively, or that it isn't quite as cosmetically attractive as a real member might be. The problem is accept it and live with it, making your life very much fuller than you would be able to if you spent too much time regretting the wooden leg. If you have it, live with it. Live through it and beyond it. And realize that you can still do a great deal. That if you must have some affliction in life, it is far better to have a wooden leg than a wooden head. And the person who fights inevitable simply has a wooden head. So patience is merely factive acceptance. And when you once have all the facts in and you see where the thing is, then you say, this is the way it has to be. Now we will build around this everything possible. We will make our life as little interfered with by these circumstances as we can. And if the goal of ambition is the thing, then the only answer lies, what we want we must earn. And it will come only in its due and proper time. And there is no way of hastening these events. Facts will get us away from most emotional excesses. And if we once accept facts and live with them, we can have a very rich life in the presence of things that might at first appear difficult. Now, let's see. What may we consider as an adequate evaluation to realize balance between the physical and metaphysical in one's earthly life? Well, it's quite a large question, but it's an interesting one also. I believe we could simplify the thinking of it a little bit. What they are really apparently looking for is some kind of a standard of evaluation for the balance between the inner and outer life of man, the life as a spiritual person and the life as a material person. Well, Jesus gives us a very good clue to that, where he says, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." Now, man in his daily life certainly has a problem of adjustments. And up to the present time, being a creature of excesses, he has run to one extreme or the other. On the one side is the rank materialist, whose life is completely addicted to the glorification of the mortal part of his own nature and its concerns. The other is an equally abstract metaphysical position, in which the individual is constantly belittling in his own mind physical life, regarding it as little better than impediment to his soul, and is longing constantly for a larger life in a freer, God-filled atmosphere. This division of interests has, to my mind, been the thing that has done more harm to popular metaphysics than any other thing that has occurred. The problem of trying to reconcile two attitudes which up to now have been met almost totally in a belligerent conflict between themselves. We feel rather badly when the materialist runs down the mystic. We feel, however, that there is real reason why the mystic should criticize the materialist. We feel definitely that metaphysics or mysticism or idealism represents such a better thing that we are perfectly justified to criticize the other person who does not agree with this, but must not in our own turn be criticized at all. Actually, the universe is one entity, and we can quote Lord Bacon on this very question. When physics is thoroughly understood, there will be no need for metaphysics. Now that's an interesting point. Well, what he is really telling us is that they are the same thing. That metaphysics is merely the extension of physics into a more rarefied atmosphere. If, therefore, our lives on different levels are run in an orderly manner, there is no possible conflict between them. Man is certainly in this world for some reason other than to suffer, even theology notwithstanding. He is here because it is a good place for him to be. It is a place which he can rather badly mutilate with his own conduct. But that is not the fault of the place. That is the fault of himself. He is actually here to learn lessons that he cannot learn anywhere else. These lessons have the greatest metaphysical significance to him. Every effort to evade material experience is an impoverishment on the metaphysical level. We must proceed by growth, naturally, from the lower to the higher by the evolutionary process in which we are now enmeshed or involved. We can never escape from the physical to the metaphysical. We must gradually grow through the various levels of development, and this growth results in an intangible kind of motion without conflict, so that the boundaries between physics and metaphysics disappear, and there is only one fact, whether it be a spiritual fact or a physical fact, because these facts are merely the same thing on different levels of activity. Consequently, I would say that for the practical person, A balance of these values is necessary. A proper physical adjustment to the world in which he lives, and a proper group of metaphysical overtones upon the psychic level of his being to act as directives upon conduct. Man achieves this balance when the internal superior part of himself governs the external inferior part of himself, but not as a tyrant, but as a benevolent leader. When man's directives come from within, and these directives are enlightened, his material career will be reasonable, rational, consistent, and profitable to him. If, however, he rebels against ineptitude in this world and seeks to go to better places because he cannot live well here, then he has frustrated his entire situation. I am again reminded of a dear old soul who said to me one day, you know, my children don't want me. I've buried 2 husbands. I've wasted all my money. I have nothing left to live for. Therefore, I'm going to give myself to God. Now, this treasure or bequest might be a little difficult on the universe. The person seeking truth must seek it because he wants to live better, wants to be a better person, not merely because he is tired of being a failure here. And if he is a failure here, then he is not likely to succeed anywhere else. Because the failure has been not the failure of the material, but the failure of the psychical control of the material. The person who has been unable to integrate here simply lacks the power to integrate. And if they go into metaphysical speculation, they will also be without integration there. Our natural growth is to recognize that through the disciplining of our daily living, we gain courage to direct our own conduct. Thus the experiences, decisions, problems, responsibilities, and duties which we carry here become the bases of integration in our psychic lives. And when our internal life is strong enough to direct our conduct, then it is also strong enough to have its own independent existence. We cannot walk out of this world. We have to work out. We cannot escape. We have to outgrow. And to outgrow means that we have to have a real victory over materialism and not be merely wounded by it. We cannot run away from it because we haven't the courage to face it. We must have achieved that degree in which it no longer presents us opportunity for growth because we've simply outgrown it. Under those conditions, we move naturally and gloriously to the next step. In the meantime, balance, moderation in every way possible, giving a reasonable degree of comfort and consolation to the body, and a reasonable degree of enlightenment, discipline, and service to the consciousness. Always striving, of course, that the best in us shall be the leader of the rest. And if the best in us leads, then our life will be toward spiritual achievement. But if in trying to lead it finds only revolution on its hands, with the lower personality in constant confusion and conflict, then we certainly are not ready to go on to anything else. To maintain value, to practice principles, to gain restraint and order, these are the powers of the soul. For actually, as Socrates tells us so very wisely, this room, this physical world in which we live, is a kind of antechamber, a school, a school in which we prepare ourselves for an immortal existence. We gain nothing by rebelling against the school. We gain everything by becoming good pupils and graduating in due time. So in the meantime, as we grow, we should live happily with the best in ourselves, and we should develop ever-increasing understanding and awareness. It is very necessary that our inner convictions shall always be subject to the proving by this world. For example, we have many ideas. Almost any individual you meet will have the solution to a world problem right now. The only thing is, he doesn't have any chance to prove it. This is the most fortunate thing that could happen to him, and also to everyone else. Because if he had a chance to prove it, he would die of a broken heart. But he goes serenely on his way, always sure that he was right, because nothing enabled him to prove that he was wrong. Under such conditions as this, our world is a kind of laboratory in which we test our ideas. We say to ourselves, I know how to get along with people. So we take the formula and try it. If in the end of 2 weeks we have more enemies than we ever had before, there's something wrong with the formula. These facts we cannot deny. Thus, in the physical world, we test our believing. We try all things and cling unto that which is good. If it was not for this need to test it here and now with our own families and our own friends, or to lay our plans and to prove our judgments, to make our investments and take our losses, if we were not here forced to these things, we would live continually in a world of abstract theories, which would never come down to ground, would never be proved or disproved, and we could live any way we wanted to without ever learning the consequences. But in this world, we are forced to live with the consequences of our own action. This is the greatest training we can have. But do not try to run away from it into some world where you think the temptations are fewer. Old St. Simon Stylites lived for half a lifetime on the top of a tall column in the Libyan desert. He had his food brought up on a rope with a bucket in order to escape the contamination of the world. All he got out of it, from what I can learn, is arteriosclerosis. He kept away from temptation, but he also kept away from every opportunity to grow. This is not the answer. The answer is that our metaphysics must become the mellow inner values by which we do things well, not only inwardly, but in the world in which we live. So the answer, are we getting along all right? What is the proper standard? The answer is that our inner ideals, leading our physical and material conduct, is resulting in a well-integrated, well-balanced, well-adjusted person. If that hasn't been achieved, something is rotten in the state of Denmark. And all our discussion of spiritual theory won't do a thing about it. Now let's see. What about laziness? Should we strive to overcome it? Well, that's getting awful close to home, because I have been a labor saver for many, many years. Laziness is certainly not a virtue, especially if it means that it implies lack of general interest in effort or hard work. Certainly, we should overcome it. If it is a chronic situation, however, it probably is not laziness. When you find an individual who has been lazy over a period of a lifetime, in the sense of just suffering from perpetual ennui, a disinclination to work, You find several things. You find that the average lazy person, so-called, can do the things they want to do very well. The problem is they do not want to do the things that make very much sense in the majority of cases. But if this laziness is more than just the sort of human frailty that we all take on, to some measure at least, then there may be reasons for it. Laziness can mean the symptom of a very deep-set frustration. Laziness can be the individual who says, like the Duke of Gloucester, if I cannot be the hero, I will be the knave. If I can't do what I want to do, I won't do anything. It is a rebellion against life. The individual who simply gradually develops a psychological inertia, an indifference to responsibility, does not take care of the responsibilities that are his, won't work, won't think. Such a person is usually in a state of acute rebellion of some kind. He is not what he wants to be. He is fighting against something, and his laziness is a low-grade symptom of suicide. He isn't going to kill himself, but he isn't going to work. He isn't going to support the thing that he doesn't believe, that doesn't make sense to him. And if he can have no happiness, he is not going to try. He may feel that no matter how hard he tried and what he got, it wouldn't mean anything to him. It would never solve the point upon which the frustration is based. Laziness can also be a general symptom of lingering physical debility. It can represent endocrine imbalance. It can represent low vitality. Laziness also arises industrially and commercially where the individual is in the wrong job, where he's not adjusted to his work and therefore does not find it interesting. The best cure there is for laziness is interest. The individual suddenly finding something that he really wants to do. Also, persons who have a little tendency that way, but who really would like to get over it, can often do so by assuming voluntary responsibilities which they cannot easily evade. You can often put yourself in a spot where you have to do something or disgrace yourself. Forcing yourself into this kind of position might cause a person normally somewhat inclined to be indolent to take a stronger hold on things for the sake of vanity. Laziness affecting young people and preventing them from going out and assuming the responsibilities of life may arise from spoilage. The individual doesn't want to work because he's never had to. He wants to continue to be a child and to enjoy the protection and support of other people. The 2 or 3-year-old child is not expected to work. It is expected to simply grow and let other people take care of it. A person reaching 20 or 25 years of age may be a perpetual infant and may be trying to escape back into their own infantile state. They do not want to accept responsibility in life. Therefore, if they do nothing, not very much can be expected of them. It is an escape to childhood, or an escape back to the helplessness of infancy. It is a kind of a pleasant state as far as the individual is concerned. A particular instance would have to be considered and analyzed. But generally speaking, an adult person who simply develops laziness needs interests that are dominant. A bad marriage will cause laziness. A bad job will do it. Some form of personal hurt, offense, something that has insulted or damaged the individual will do it. Battle fatigue will carry with it indolence, sometimes to the degree of continuing unconsciousness over a long period of time. Rebellion against society can do it. Very often, the lazy or indolent person develops the idea that the world owes him a living. These attitudes arise from immature relationships with life. An individual who from early life has a frantic desire to escape responsibility, and that by refuses marriage, refuses advancement in position and office, refuses distinctions of all kinds, refuses to make decisions. Such an individual will also sometimes reach a state in which lack of self-discipline makes organized effort practically impossible. This is usually accompanied by a great deal of personal discomfort. The individual is defending doing nothing so desperately that he is miserable at the job. Also, laziness is premature retirement. The individual who has too great a dream of doing nothing in the future may start doing it now. Actually, however, again, it is lack of social adjustment and lack of acceptance of mature personal responsibility for life. If you can get these persons to become involved in something that really interests them, they usually will snap out of it. If they show symptoms of being unable to control the situation, then they should consult a physician for physical causes, which can be all kinds of things. Some of them, unfortunately, not too well known to medicine today. Or they should consult a counselor to see whether there is a psychic block in which this is a form of rebellion against society. Usually one cause or another will be found, and if thought about carefully, can be solved. How for should one? I'm getting it. That for is a far. Only they brought the A way up to the top. How far should one go toward control of temperament? Well, probably within reason, about as far as they can. Mostly they're not going to go too far because patience and energy are going to give out well on this side of overtaxing themselves. One should control temperament only to the degree of recognizing that where control is necessary, there's something wrong with the temperament. A temperament should never basically be just controlled. An individual should never be willing simply to get along with an impossible situation by preventing it from breaking out. He should go immediately to work to correct the cause of the situation. If he has to control his temperament, then his temperament needs work. It needs reorganization, it needs improvement and enrichment. Because actually temperament should be energy available to us for work. It should not be something we have to combat all the way along year after year. So control it to the degree that it does not cause conflict with society. Obviously, we're not going to neglect the control of antisocial tendencies. We are not going to permit criminal delinquencies. We're not going to permit temperament to lead us away from mature, responsible action. But when it comes to the more subtle aspects of temperament, if we have difficulty living with ourselves, then we must change from the inside. We must find that mistakes in temperament, attitudes that are unreasonable, arise from philosophical perspective that is unreasonable. And wherever there is the unreasonable, there must be a search for the factual. And very often, specialized training in some field helps us with this. The mind must be constructively occupied. Energy must be constructively used. Very often, negative habits simply represent energy not in use constructively. And temperaments straighten out when we're so busy that we forget we have temperaments. And being busy in improving ourselves and strengthening our characters we are not so inclined to fall into temperamental lapses. If, however, there isn't enough inner life to keep us vital, then peculiarities of disposition become overly important to us. I would say, therefore, that this problem of controlling temperament should be the problem of the person discovering that he has temperamental problems and determining to so enrich his life that they cannot endure in the same body with him. And he can do this slowly. He isn't going to do it quickly. But his temperamental problems, again, may have psychological cause. An individual, for instance, who has great need in his work or something of that nature for more education than he has, may become embittered and soured by the fact that every job he ever wanted went to somebody who was a little better qualified than he had been able to be. Now, perhaps he couldn't help this at the time. It may have been that he was forced to be self-sustaining or to take on responsibilities and was unable to gain adequate education. But his temperament may be soured by a series of circumstances. If so, he always has the opportunity to straighten this out. I gave the graduating talk one year for a group of physicians in one of the medical schools here, and they graduated 2 students, a man and his own grandson. The older man graduated as a physician in his late 70s, but he did it. It is something he'd always wanted to do. He was determined to do it. Now, it's many times it wouldn't have to be quite as excessive as this, but there are many people who have hated life for 40 years because they didn't have a high school diploma. They wouldn't admit it, but under analysis they proved it. Or they hated the fact that they had some minor defect in appearance, which might have been corrected with plastic surgery. They disliked themselves intensely because of some peculiarity of weight, being too thin or too heavy. These things gradually ate their way into the individual, and under analysis he may reveal these things. And in the quietude of his own life he may admit them. If so, he can save a lot of money on analysis. But if you have a suspicion that any temperamental problem is arising from a frustration of some natural and proper desire in yourself, then one of the answers to your temperament is, regardless of age or circumstance, go out and do the thing that you always knew you wanted to do, providing it is in the form of self-improvement and is a proper and reasonable thing. This often loosens up a bad situation and causes the person to no longer feel that he has been shortchanged by life. Temperament can often be soured by circumstances, particularly long-enduring ones. Temperament can be ruined by memory, in which we remember certain ills or evils that we suffered from and have never forgiven somebody for something. All these things can be thought through, and when you think them through factually, then you are in a little better position to cope with them. For to discover the fact is 2/3 of the cure. And once you know what is the cause, you realize that it is then possible to you not to control the thing, but to correct it. And the correction is the proper solution in almost every case. Oh, let's see what we have on this one. How can I overcome disturbed feelings caused from being unjustly criticized, from advice given to me that I do not need? I have a tendency to brood over these trifles for days, and they affect my concentration for studying and learning. Well, here's a person who is disturbed by being unjustly criticized. Might as well give that up. It will not do the slightest amount of good. Someone once said to Socrates, Master, your neighbors and your friends are all saying the most unpleasant things about you. What are you going to do? Socrates thought for a moment. He said, I am going to so live that no one will believe them. And this is about all you can do with that problem. But actually, criticism by another will not hurt you in any way unless you accept it. If the criticism is just, it might hurt a good deal. But then you know what to do to correct it. If the criticism is not just, then it cannot hurt you. The fact that you are criticized will never do you a bit of harm. The thing that will hurt you is brooding over it. That you have control of. If you do not brood over it, make something out of it, worry about it, it can do you no harm. You will never yet or never live to be overthrown by a breath of air. And you will have to overthrow yourself. So the answer to the whole situation is to realize that there is no need to accept any sense of pressure as a result of what another person says or does, unless they're right. If they're right, it is not that you should fear them or worry about them or dislike them. If they are right, you should be grateful to them. So if the criticism is good, it earns your gratitude. If it is not good, the criticism belongs to the critic and not to you. He will have to live with it. You do not have to, unless you insist on it by making it a part of your own life. Don't brood over these things. Don't worry about them. But if a person gives you some advice that you do not need, be sure you do not need it. And if you do not need it, do the same thing when someone gives you a Christmas present that you do not need. I am sure that someone sometime has given you a present that was of no value to you. The only thing you could do was thank them. There's not much else you can do. You would say to the individual who gave you an old-fashioned 18th century bootjack because they thought you loved antiques, you would say to yourself, this person meant well. A good-natured soul. Kindly. Here I have a white elephant. The only thing I can possibly do with it is to give it to someone else next Christmas. And be sure it isn't the person who gave it to me. Take these problems of unneeded advice much in the same manner. Thank the person. If they meant well, they are entitled to your thanks. You do not have to follow it. But you do not have to resent it. Graciously accept a good intention. If you're not sure whether it was good or not, assume that it is. And if you're perfectly certain that it wasn't well intended, accept that. And realize it is not your own problem. It remains with them unless you take it on. Just don't take it on. Don't brood over these trifles for days and days and let them upset your concentration. They have no reason to do so. This world is made up of an infinite number of persons with an infinite capacity to misunderstand each other. But you do not have to be moved by these things. Just relax, and in your concentration, be sure to include something that will help you to understand your critic. Help you to realize that perhaps this criticism is well intended. Perhaps these people are even a little wiser about you than you are about yourself. Search their criticism for truth. If you find it, be grateful. If it is totally wrong, and there is nothing you can do about it, and nothing that you can do with it, it is simply not yours. So just leave it where it is. There is no reason why you or anyone else should be forced to take it on. Well, here's a question. What is the grace of God? I think that the grace of God, as it is used in the Scripture, the word grace implies graciousness. It implies kindliness. It implies, in a sense, a loving recognition of the frailty of man, a paternal or maternal instinct to love the wayward because it belongs to them, and is the infinite wisdom, love, thought, tenderness with which the infinite has surrounded its creative processes, so that by the grace of God we shall achieve in spite of ourselves if we do not achieve because of ourselves. The grace of God, therefore, is perhaps that part of the infinite plan that ensures that all things in the fullness of time shall fulfill themselves, and that nothing shall be lost. There was an ancient belief that man was saved by grace, and that is by intercession. I think what we mean more than that by that now is that this universe is not only a universe of law, but that law itself is an aspect of love. Therefore, that the love in the universe, the love by which all things are enriched because of the divine content in them, that the love in all things, the love you find in the mother animal guarding its young, the love that we see naturally everywhere until men destroy it by their own conduct, that this love which causes us to be patient, to be kind, to be thoughtful, to expect not too much, to still care for those who may have injured us in some degree. These things represent a grace that is beyond wisdom or beyond mere intellectualism. Therefore, in nature, the grace of God is the love that never fails, even when man fails that love. And we have a touch of it in human nature, so we begin to realize what it is, and realize that this universe is not only working itself out according to a divine plan, but that that divine plan itself is rooted in the infinite love of the Creator for that which it has fashioned in its own image. So that grace is something that we can extend in the form of graciousness and consideration to all things, to live beautifully, to live kindly, to live in an orderly, civilized way, to practice certain charities of thought, certain niceties of relationship, certain dignities of association, because they are the gracious ways of living. And at the root of all graciousness is the graciousness of the infinite, by means of which everything, in spite of its own ignorance or perversion, is rather beautifully, gently, lovingly, and wisely being brought to its maturity. It is this wonderful sense of beauty in things that makes laws radiant, that makes problems luminous, and touching the heart and mind, make these powers also superphysical, supermental, super-emotional, lifting them into a cosmic union. These situations constitute grace, and that grace in the nature of deity is that power by which deity is not only the great creator, but always through all things the loving parent and the kindly friend. These qualities, it would seem to me, would help us to understand the meaning of the grace of God. Now our time is up, so we'll put these carefully away, and if we have a shortage on any one of the other evenings, we will keep on with them. So if we didn't get to you tonight, don't think you may never be answered, because we have no way of knowing how long the questions will be or how many. So we'll keep these, and it's quite possible that you'll get answers for these also as you go along. And now our time is up, so we'll see you again next week.